Positive risk taking. This is the phrase that represents the overarching subject of the whole of this 5 module training course. My fundamental approach to good risk decision making. But more specifically for this module 1, thinking about this idea of our risk mindset shift and shifting of the risk agenda, then positive risk taking is what I believe is at the core of achieving that necessary change of our thinking. But do you really know what this phrase means? So what is it? Well, first of all, what is it not? It's not the negligent ignorance of the risks, but it is taking a chance or a gamble in a constructive and thoughtful way, not in a negligent way. And it's also represented by a range of words that you see on this slide. It's about seizing opportunity. It's about representing things that we gain through the choices that we make, having some personal control over the decisions that we make, feeling personally autonomous through all of these other phrases about personal control, choice, decision making. But then alongside that comes responsibility. If we're going to take a risk, we have to be responsible for thinking through the whole issue. Why and how are we going to take that risk? And usually, not always, you'll have to do it on your own in certain circumstances, but it should more often be about collaborating with others. Taking those big challenging decisions quite often can feel quite isolating, but we can do it with more confidence, perhaps, if we're engaged with others. Doing it by moving forward together. It doesn't always go right, most of the time it does. But that's where it's important about reflecting on genuine learning and how we grow as a result of taking risks, and how we change as a result of the changes we could be making in our lives. And ultimately, you'll see positive risk taking is an essential part of our lived experience for all of us. We all do it. It's an everyday event. For me, it was an idea that I created back in mental health services in 1994 within the team, the service that I was working in at the time. Some of us were attending a lecture by a lawyer called David Carson, and he was talking about risk taking in mental health. I and a couple of colleagues from the team I was in, we went away pretty much inspired by some of the ideas that came across in that lecture. But then I was pondering it more and more, particularly as I was in the process of writing my second textbook, Helping Relationships in Mental Health, at that particular time. Risk taking as 2 words didn't quite capture what it was that we felt we were doing in the kind of groundbreaking case management work that our team was involved in at that time in the early 1990s. But on reflection, I added the word positive to the phrase risk taking because that really did seem to better capture what we were doing at the time. And I'll say why and what that's about in a moment or two. But that's where the idea emerged from. So I came up with the concept of positive risk taking in response to that lecture that I attended back in 1994. It's very much about what people can do, what they want to do. So it's strengths based, which will be the focus very much of Module 4 of this training. It's part of a healthy way of living. Risk is an essential part of our day-to-day life. If you were to take, or let's say if I was to take risk out of your life, pretty much immediately you'd want to be bringing risk back into your life. Taking risks in positive and constructive ways engages people. But we should also focus on engaging those around them, those who they trust the most as well, drawing those in, the people that can help and support to make their aspirations work, turn them into achievements. It's about making reasoned decisions, very clear reasoned decisions. But it's also very much based in being aware of the different options that are available. It's not about seeing something that we like and then just putting the blinkers on, removing from our vision or ignoring any evidence or information that might challenge our particular preference. No, blinkers need to be off for positive risk taking to be happening in practice. We need to be open and really analysing information around the different options that are available. Because there's that phrase again, there's no such thing as a risk-free option. So at this stage, I also want to say language and the use of language is so important in all aspects of life, particularly when I'm talking about this phrase, positive risk taking. What is it? Well, it's about taking action. It's about taking risks. There's two of the three words. Positive risk taking is about taking risks. But it's about taking risks for very specific reasons. And those reasons are to do with the positive outcomes we want to achieve. You've only got to reflect on moments in your own life, your own career, because we all do it. We all take risks in our lives. And with very few exceptions, the reason why we do it is because we can see a benefit that we will gain. We see a positive outcome. And that simply is what positive risk taking is. And I argue that if a person, practitioner, or whatever field you're working in, is not clear about the positive outcome of the decision you're facing, then as a general rule, don't take the risk. There's something about a very clearly articulated outcome that really does help us to shape the risk we're going to take, shape the plan to put it into action, shape and elevate the chances of it really working and succeeding. But again, I come back to the use of language, because I'm not talking here about phrases such as positive risk. Positive risk taking is not to be collapsed into it's all about positive risk. I hear that phrase time and time again over many years that I've been discussing and developing the theme with practitioners, particularly in health and social care. No, it is not positive risk. If I ask a few people what they mean when they use that phrase positive risk, I get a range of different answers, which is not very helpful when we need clarity in our communications. Also, part of the work I did back in 2006, 2007, as part of a group in the Department of Health in London, at that time, they created this phrase positive risk management, which is not something I particularly adhere to. In my opinion, that's too general. It's a kind of direction of travel, a loose way of putting a positive spin on this whole idea of managing risk, which might more frequently be seen to focus on negative restrictions. So, in terms of language, the ideas of positive risk or positive risk management, to me, are much too vague. They're too general. And the problem is that when we communicate through language that is vague and general, we might be very clear in our own heads what we're trying to communicate, but the people on the receiving end are not necessarily going to interpret that information in the way that you intended. By contrast, positive risk taking is very specific to an individual at a particular time, in a particular set of circumstances, focused on a particular outcome. So let's give you a definition, capturing what I've just been saying. Positive risk taking is weighing up the potential benefits and harms of exercising one choice of action over another. That's ensuring that we're constantly remaining open and aware of the different choices. It was based on a clear appreciation of the risks, so it's part of good risk assessment. which is not an end in itself. Good risk assessment is a means to an end. We can't really take a risk unless we've got a good appreciation, a good understanding of assessing the risks of the different choices, of those different courses of action. It's the development of detailed plans and actions, so it informs and supports good risk management. You may make a clearly stated positive risk-taking decision, and the action, the plan, almost falls out of it. It's based in the capabilities and the expressed wishes of the individual person, the client, the service user, whoever it is that you're particularly working with. So it's based in a strengths approach, which, as I've mentioned before, will be addressed in greater detail in Module 4. And it's about achieving the desired positive outcomes, which will be very specifically stated. But also going back to the idea of minimizing, not eliminating risk, we can also minimize the potential harmful outcomes of the course of action that risk-taking represents. So there's a definition, capturing all of this information on one slide. What are the main characteristics of positive risk-taking? Well, collaboration. I've been talking about this quite a bit. If we're going to be shifting the agenda, developing the risk mindset, collaboration of all the relevant people with the knowledge, with the interest of stakeholders in the particular decision, bringing them together in collaboration. This also means we can then share responsibility for making the decision. The burden, the weight of making a very difficult decision is shared, distributed, and held. And I'd suggest that it's carried more if it's experienced as a shared responsibility, rather than if it's just me on my own, where it then becomes difficult to not allow all of those earlier parts of this module, the politics of fear, the blame culture, to creep in and have an impact on my thinking, on my actions. It's about being prepared to work together and learn along the way. So things will go wrong, and we're learning. We're constantly revising information and processing information, and we'll change decisions on that basis. And there's a continuing focus on the can do, on what the person can do, as opposed to constantly just looking for the negative information of what they can't do or they shouldn't do. Everyone involved should be open, so we're prepared to try out ideas. Try out strapping that bungee cord to your ankle that you may well have seen in an earlier presentation, that image. Personally, I've jumped out of airplanes and I've flown gliders. But the idea of a bungee jump does not appeal at all. Well, there you go. We can't all be positive risk takers in all aspects of our lives. But everyone working diligently with this concept should be prepared to try out ideas. And as with all of my discussion here about risk and the mindset around risk, it's dynamic. There should be daily vigilance, and plans can change when the evidence indicates a need to change them. What's needed to support it, to put it into practice? This kind of overlaps a little bit with the main characteristics. Being really person-centered, focused on the individual. That's not just rhetoric in nice policies, it's reality. The way we can demonstrate this is the way we all think and work and how we will deliver. We're not just focusing on risk aversion. But let me say at this point, this is not a presentation that is all about risk aversion being bad and risk taking being good. I mentioned earlier, it's about being able to shift our judgments, shift on the tolerance scale that I showed you earlier on. It's about really thinking through the information, but drawing on these positive elements, these strengths elements, which might help us to challenge the blame culture and move, not just be fixed in a risk-averse way of thinking. Next point there, everybody involved understands what the concept means and that it means something very specific, not just vague and general. Decisions are made collectively, they're reasoned, and they're clearly identified as being in the person's best interests. It's listening to the person, going back to that person-centered point at the beginning. But certainly for those of you involved in health and social care, you'll be aware of something called mental capacity. In the UK, we particularly have something called the Mental Capacity Act. Where somebody's not deemed to have capacity, we can still be enacting this concept of positive risk-taking where it's relevant, where we see the positive gains for the person. But we must be really clear that decisions we're making and risks that we're taking on their behalf, or working with them to take risks, are clearly in their best interests. It needs to be based in clear principles, and I set out a series of principles earlier on that hopefully underpin this way of thinking. But we also need tools that are fit for purpose, that will support us to make these types of decisions. Tools that will enable us to put these decisions into action. So the tools available to us, and I'll outline some of those across the modules, it's vitally important that they are there to really help us deliver this way of thinking. I'm not talking here about ticking more boxes for the sake of administrative purposes. It's about being creative in how we procure resources. It's about being open-minded, flexible, creative, and innovative, not being focused on the notion of, well, this is what's available in our particular sector, this is what's available through our particular service. No, we need to be constantly pushing those boundaries in creative ways. So that's pretty much it for this particular presentation in this part of Module 1. Here's a manual that I produced back in 2013, Risk Decision Making, Working with Risk and Implementing Positive Risk Taking. A lot of what you've heard here and in subsequent modules will have emerged from that piece of work, as well as some of my other publications, all of which are very much tied in with practice development work in and alongside services, informed by the experiences of practitioners. I'll ask you to reflect back on this positive risk-taking presentation. Check out the definitions information sheet and the what needs to be in place to support positive risk-taking to happen, a worksheet, both of which are attached to this module. Think and reflect on your use of language. What have you learned here? What does the concept mean to you in your life, in your work? How are you putting these ideas into practice yourself and indeed with colleagues? And finally, what changes can you consider making in your practice and or in the teams that you work in? Okay, and thank you for your attention.